Good morning. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you for joining us. I want to welcome all of our members and new viewers in California and across the United States. And thank you all for supporting the Council Town Hall through your contributions, by becoming members, and by renewing your memberships. As one of our members recently shared with me, the need for our balanced, nonpartisan discussions is more critical than ever before. We strive to welcome speakers with varying viewpoints and perspectives. These live streams that you're enjoying will continue to be a staple part of our programming going forward. And as soon as we can do so safely, we will be bringing back our popular in-person events. Those in-person events were a key driver of our revenues. Today, we are offering these live streams free of charge as a public service, which is why we can't do this without you. Please go to our website at lawac.org to see how you can support our mission so that we can continue to provide you with this quality interactive programming. Now, as many of you know, every Thursday we have a terrific series called Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Congressman Adam Schiff in conversation with politics professor Dan Schnur. They will be discussing what we originally planned to talk about today, the nation's response to COVID-19, but they will also be addressing the current unrest in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, as it is dominating the public conversation. Now, Dan, it's time for me to turn this over to you. Thank you.
Well, Kim, thank you so much for having us here today. And thanks to the entire team at the World Affairs Council, to Jessica, to Claire, to Marianne, and to the entire team. And also a special thanks to Emily Simons and Jenna Galper from the office of our special guest, Congressman Adam Schiff, because both of them were so instrumental in helping to make today's program work. Congressman, we're very, very happy to have you with us today. And I'm a little bit concerned because we need to talk about George Floyd. We need to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. We need to talk about FISA and surveillance issues. Former Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein testified yesterday. We want to talk about voting by mail. And I'm particularly eager to get your thoughts on whether Major League Baseball will come back this summer. And so it's an awful lot for us to accomplish in 56 minutes, but we'll do our best. We'll do our best to get to it. For our audience, and because we have the good fortune to be joined by the Congressman today, we have a larger audience than normal. And so there's just 2 points I'd make before Congressman Schiff and I begin the conversation. One is for those of you who have been participating in these webinars in the past, you know that in the past, I've spoken about the book by historian John Meacham, his book, The Soul of America. And Meacham writes about past examples of racial and societal division and animosity in our country since before we were a country. And so now more than ever, it's important to remember the central lesson of that book. It requires unlikely men and women to stand up for what's right, particularly during such difficult times. The other point I'll mention for those of you who might be new is this online series, Politics in the Time of Pandemic, arose out of a breakfast series that we began last year at the World Affairs Council Town Hall called the Cal Eisenberg Breakfast Series. And the Eisenberg Breakfast Series was named after my late Uncle Cal. And as I've told many of you in the past, the lesson I learned from him is the importance of exposing ourselves to a variety of opinions and a variety of perspectives, and being able to discuss and to debate those in a civil and respectful way. We're excited to have Congressman Schiff with us here today. We're currently in conversations with the office of Representative Kevin McCarthy and Senator Marco Rubio as well. And so as we progress through this time of pandemic, we want to hear from the smartest people on both sides of the aisle to expose all of us to a wide range of perspectives. So that rather lengthy lead-in aside, Congressman, we do have a lot to cover, but I do want to start with, I think what most of us would agree is the most pressing and most important news of the day, perhaps even more than the COVID-19 threat. And that's the challenge we're facing as a country in the wake of the George Floyd and the Ahmaud Arbery and the Breonna Taylor tragedies and so many others. And I guess where I'd like to start with you, Congressman, is there's so many issues that fit into this broader discussion: the protests, social unrest, police reform, questions relating to race, to public safety, to community. But it seems to me at the core, one of the things we're really struggling with is a divisiveness in our society. And so the question I'd ask you to begin is, how can we, from different political perspectives, from different heritages and backgrounds and different starting points, how should we be thinking collectively about how to overcome that divisiveness in order to address these issues in an effective way?
Well, Dan, thank you for moderating again today. Thank you to the council for the great work that it does to bring people together to hear different viewpoints and help inform the public on key issues. I think you have started out with one of the most cross-cutting and one of the most difficult, and that is the increasing inability of Americans to speak with each other. The enormous divide within the country right now, and how did we get into this situation? How do we get out of it? It won't surprise you, I know, to hear me say that there are a lot of reasons, a lot of root causes behind why we're so divided as a nation. I think probably the most significant, and this is really the most difficult to address, is simply how we get our information now. You and I are both old enough to remember Walter Cronkite. In fact, I remember going back to my dorm in college to hear his last broadcast. That was a time when there was a large body of agreed upon fact, and we could differ on what to do with those facts, but at least we agreed that there was such a thing called fact. And we have moved very far away from that world in which most Americans got their news from one of three networks. And there was this sort of conventional wisdom about what was happening, to a model in the 90s and early 2000s of getting our news, much of it from cable news, where people would turn into the news they wanted to hear to reinforce the views they had before they turned it on, to a situation now where we get our information largely through social media. And the algorithms curate what we see, and it's really, I think, a revelation to a great many people over the age of 25 that what you see on your news feed is not the same thing as I see. That in fact, the algorithms know where we live and how old we are, what we like and what we dislike, what we share and don't share. And that, I think, has dramatically contributed to the divide. I'm acutely conscious of this wherever I go. Now, my travel is more limited now than it had been, but with people who would stop me in airports, and one person would come up to me and say, "Are you Adam Schiff? I just want to shake your hand. You're my hero." And immediately thereafter, the next person would come up to me and say, "You lie all the time. Why do you lie all the time?" And I would think to myself, okay, I know what you're watching and I know what you're reading, and it's obviously not the same thing because I'm the same person. And that, I think, is among the most difficult challenges the nation has, because as a government, we're not going to legislate what people can say or what they can watch or what Fox News can say in prime time or any of these other issues. And so, I do think it's going to take time for us to figure out this new world of social media in which fear and lies travel far faster than truths or love or other positive attributes. I think it's going to take time. I think the advent of social media is every bit as disruptive as the invention of the printing press, but we had centuries to get used to that innovation, and this one has come on us with lightning speed.
Well, I think it's a really, really smart point. We'll call it the smartphoneification of American political debate. And so if some of us rely on one cable channel or on one website or one blog for a set of information, and the others rely on a completely different set of information and opinion sources, you're exactly right. The chasm is profound. one of the things that we take real pride in at the World Affairs Council Town Hall is we do draw a fairly broad cross-section of ideological perspective and grounding among our members. And so I guess the question I would ask you to follow up on the first one is, given this divisiveness, given an opportunity to talk to those who might not agree with you on every issue, and in particular who might have lined up on a different side of you during some very high-profile debate over the last couple of years, is there a message that you would care to deliver to those Americans who may have disagreed with you in the past about how to come together given this common challenge?
There is, and I guess I would say, and I think this addresses a lot of the supporters of the president. I think there are different categories of people that supported the president or continue to support the president. Many did, I think, in 2016 because their lives were very difficult. They had played by the rules. They'd done everything they were supposed to do, and yet they were on the end of their career. They had little saved. They were going to have to face a retirement in which they were facing potential poverty. Their communities were in decline. The future looked bleak. And here was this person promising something different, something new. And I think people were ready to embrace that, whether that was the revolution that Bernie Sanders was offering or the disruption that Donald Trump was offering. I think, frankly, the way for me and others to communicate with those who made that choice 4 years ago is that that was an understandable choice to make. People knew what they had with a Clinton because they'd had a Clinton. They knew what they'd had with a Bush because they'd had a Bush, and yet their lives had not appreciably improved. That was a rational choice. I think the rational choice now, given that we see just how divisive this president has been, is to move the country in a very different direction. And I start at this point of focus on the presidency because I think a lot of what is driving the division in the country right now comes from the very top. As Secretary Mattis pointed out in that very powerful statement he issued yesterday, and this is a point, frankly, I've been making for months and years now. This is the first president in my lifetime who does not view it as part of his job to make us a more perfect union, but rather who I think gets up in the morning determined to find new and inventive ways to divide us. And it's very difficult to bring the country together when the person with the strongest bully pulpit continues to try to drive us apart. I think each of us individually, though, need to do our own part to bring people together to try to heal the divisions in the country, divisions along lines of race, but political divisions as well. I try to do that by showing respect to those who disagree with me and hearing out what people have to say. I think it's often as important, sometimes more important for me to hear from the people who disagree with me as those that do agree with me. And I think all of us in our individual lives need to make that effort because in the climate we're in the news environment that I described, but with the president willfully trying to divide us, I think going to fall on all of us from a bottom up rather than a top down approach to bridge these divides.
So before we move on to the more specific policy challenges we face as a country in the wake of these recent tragedies, I will once again remind our participants that for those of you who were discomforted by what you just heard from the congressman, we will be talking to Representative McCarthy and Senator Rubio in the future. And for those of you who agreed with what you just heard from Congressman Schiff, I'll warn you, we'll be hearing from Representative McCarthy or Senator Rubio in the future. Once again, the goal here is not to have an anodyne discussion, but to present a wide range of opinions. And I've known Adam Schiff since he was a member of the state legislature. We've agreed on some things, disagreed on others. But to me, he's exactly the type of example of that kind of discussion we need to be having. So let's dig in now. Policy reforms. Congressman Speaker Pelosi and your colleague, Congressman Jerry Nadler of New York, have announced that they'll be holding hearings later this month to talk about how to address the various issues that have come up in the wake of Mr. Floyd's tragic death. Now, some of these issues already seem to be attracting a pretty broad base of support. use of force standards, de-escalation training for new law enforcement officers. Those seem to be the more straightforward and even the easier steps. But then there's questions about mandatory body cameras, about a national database for the so-called gypsy cops, someone who's fired from one law enforcement agency, then goes to work for another. Questions about mandatory independent investigations, termination policies. I know the House is going to examine questions of qualified legal immunity for law enforcement. Given the breadth of these policy challenges, what do you see as the most important steps forward for the Congress to take?
Well, we are going to, as you described, be having oversight hearings and producing a broad package of reforms designed to address the problem of systemic racism within the criminal justice system. And I imagine it will have many of the ingredients that you just outlined. The package will be conceptualized and I think largely drafted with the participation and leadership of the Congressional Black Caucus. I think that among the most significant reforms that you mentioned will be a whole new training regimen for law enforcement, as well as a requirement that departments engage in their own analytics in terms of outcomes so that they can identify biases within their own department and can take action against them. And I think that this deals with not just the overt racism, but the implicit bias that I think is present within all of us and is also present within law enforcement. And sometimes you need the hard, cold, objective light of day and analysis and facts to be able to see what is otherwise not visible within a department. But the reality is, after I think tinkering around the edges now for years and years and not seeing the picture appreciably change, we're going to need more than incremental reforms. We're going to really need systemic change here. So I think it will involve, frankly, I was one of the earliest supporters in Congress of body cams and supported legislation to fund body cams and expand body cams, develop new policies on body cams. But I think we're going to need far greater transparency within our police departments, much greater accountability for errant police officers, much greater training in terms of ferreting out bias and racism within departments. I think we're going to need police commissions with teeth. We're going to need independent prosecutorial judgment. And I don't minimize how difficult this is. I remember as a state legislator, Dan, and you'll appreciate this, taking on the prison guard union, when I moved to allow the state attorney general to have concurrent authority, concurrent jurisdiction to prosecute cases of prison violence committed by prison guards. The problem there is often where the prisons are located, you had elected county district attorneys that were unwilling to bring these cases. And those who did would be obliterated by expenditures against them. But in any event, I could not prevail in this legislation. It was just too big a hurdle to overcome the opposition of that very powerful group representing prison guards. So I don't think this is going to be easy, but I think that there is a national awakening. None of us will ever be able to shed the image in our mind of George Floyd being strangled to death in broad daylight, and with a police officer who was doing it with such a character of immunity, almost entitlement, that I think just makes us all nauseous, but is indicative of how prevalent, pervasive, and accepted this racism and bias has become.
Well, and for those of you who have not followed Adam Schiff's career for as long as I have, I should point out that long before he went to Congress, as a member of the state Senate, he played a key role on the state Senate Judiciary Committee. And even before that, worked as a federal prosecutor. So these are issues he's thought about for many, many years. Congressman,
I have to say, Dan, I appreciate you saying that. I have to say, though, that the advent of cell phone video and later body cams opened my eyes in a way that nothing really had before then. And maybe it shouldn't have been necessary for me to see it with my own eyes, but it really was. And it was a shocking awakening to see shooting after shooting, now strangling after strangling. And I think it's been important for the whole country, but particularly people who are not of color, to see what people of color go through in this country, and to be able to see it in their own eyes. But that came as a bitter awakening when it shouldn't.
Well, I think one of the things we've learned, Democrats or Republicans, or us independents, is sometimes the old saying, "A picture's worth 1,000 words," is an understatement when it comes to matters like these. I'm going to ask you to put on your intelligence committee hat for a minute now going forward. We've already seen some evidence in other countries, of particularly those with questionable human rights records of their own, taking advantage of this opportunity in order to criticize the US while at the same time minimizing their own excesses. There's also been some evidence that as we've been understandably distracted by the COVID-19 pandemic, there are any number of international players, China, Russia, and others, who look to potentially be taking advantage of our shifted focus. Without sharing any information that's not appropriate for a broader audience, is there anything that you can tell us from an intelligence perspective on the global stage that we should be thinking about as we confront these domestic challenges?
Yes, and I guess I'd put it in a couple of different categories. The first is a real decline in America's standing in the world, which is a grave tragedy for us, but it's also a tragedy for people around the world who have looked to the United States for inspiration, who have looked to the United States for refuge, and now see the military called out to confront peaceful protesters. They see the President of the United States behaving like the leaders of their own autocratic countries. And today is the anniversary, I think, of the Tiananmen massacre. And we are rightly calling on China to reform itself. In China, you still can post images of those that violent put down of peaceful demonstrators in Tiananmen Square. Well, you can imagine how difficult it is for the United States to make that point now, and how China can and is throwing it back in our face. And of course, it's not just China, but gleefully others in Iran, in Moscow, and elsewhere are pointing to the United States and saying, there is the hypocrisy on full display. So I think it's been quite tragic for freedom-loving people around the world to see this spectacle going on in this country. But I also think that it comes at a very dangerous time in the history of democracy, our own and democracy around the world, where democracy is already under assault, where autocrats have already been on the rise in places like the Philippines with Duterte, with Al-Sisi in Egypt, Erdogan in Turkey, with Orban in Hungary. All over the globe, you see a rise of autocracy. And I think the actions of this administration are hardly making the case for democracy. And I will add to that our very poor and tragic handling of the pandemic. But the other thing I would alert people to is in 2016, the Russians had two objectives in interfering in our election. They wanted to help their favorite candidate get elected, Donald Trump, but they also wanted to divide America further along known fault lines of race, immigration status, ethnicity, orientation, Second Amendment issues. Well, they have a ripe opportunity now to divide the United States, to weaken the United States by exacerbating these divisions, by furthering and inflaming protests. They have the opportunity as well in the fall, given the president is doing his best to discredit the legitimacy of the votes of millions of Americans who vote by absentee ballot and will need to during a pandemic. They have the ability also to discredit the results of our election And that poses a very grave risk to the country. The president should be pushing back against that kind of foreign intervention, should be doing what he can to shore up confidence and faith in our electoral system, but his actions are doing exactly the opposite, and in their way, really inviting this kind of foreign meddling in our affairs.
Well, and we'll be going. Don't worry, people. We'll be going to your questions in just a few minutes. But out of pure selfishness, I do want to spend a couple more minutes following up because I think the congressman has made a couple of really important points here. And so we're going to go just a little bit further before we broaden the conversation. I think your point is a well taken one, Congressman Schiff. And there's no question that over the next roughly 5 months, this is going to be one of the major points that Vice President Biden and President Trump will be debating. One of the challenges they both face, just to broaden the discussion a little bit, is one of the challenges they both face, or that both parties face, I should say, is the growing rise of isolationism within the base of both parties. And I know you're someone who's always taken justifiable pride in taking a global view on a lot of the challenges we face. It's understandable how in a time of economic downturn, particularly facing a health crisis like this one, along with our other domestic challenges, but more and more it seems like the U.S. Population is more and more willing to retreat from the rest of the world. So for the base of both the Republican and the Democratic parties, what's the type of message that can remind people of the importance of the role this country should be playing on the world stage?
Well, I think that if there's anything to make the case for global leadership and global engagement, it's a pandemic. It's a virus that can emerge anywhere in the world and can threaten the entire world, in which no country is an island. Pandemics are a product of trends that are going to accelerate their danger. The trend of globalization and broad global travel, the trend of increasing human encroachment on wild spaces and wildlife, and the urbanization of the world. These things are going to make dangers like pandemics that much worse. The loss of life from this pandemic has already exceeded Vietnam and every war we've had since, put together. And so if we're thinking about the security of our country, we have to think about how we act globally to protect against global threats. There's no way simply to wall ourselves off from them. And indeed, I think when you look across the world stage at the continued development of its nuclear program in North Korea, at Iran now going back to enrichment, and how close we came to being at war with Iran, at Russia's increasing menace around the world, at the rise of China and the frightening death toll from the pandemic. A strategy of America alone, which is really what America First has become, has not mitigated these threats. It has aggravated them. And so I think that the experience of the last 3 years of withdrawal has made the point more powerfully than I think anything else could about why American leadership is necessary, why the international order has served us so well. We should not be withdrawing and ceding leadership of the WHO to China. We should be engaging and strengthening and improving, reforming if necessary, the WHO. But retreat from the world stage has gotten us nowhere except to alienate our allies, embolden and empower our adversaries, and make the world a far more dangerous place.
And I'll recommend to our audience, for those of you who might not have read it, a tremendous piece in the Washington Post recently by Robert Kagan, who talked about how while this country was understandably distracted by the economic challenges of the Great Depression, it created opportunities for Italy and Germany and Japan to rise through the 1930s. And while comparing today to that pre-World War II era as a parallel fraught with peril, I think the broader lesson is just the point the Congressman made, that simply because a lot of us are inclined to disengage doesn't mean the problems of the world go away. Congressman, I had a battery of
one other point on this, Dan, and indeed any of these topics would merit a full hour. But the most important relationship, the most determinative, I think, in terms of the direction of the world over the next century is likely to be the U.S.-China relationship. As we confront the rise of China and the power of China, we are going to want allies. And China is now quite shrewdly using its power and its money to win friends and buy friends around the world. It is investing in the WHO as we are disinvesting. It is investing in development around the world as we are disinvesting. It is militarizing the South China Sea. We have natural allies in the region to push back against all of these things, but we are not doing so effectively. I do think that some of what you described in your question will be necessary in the sense of we will need to onshore some critical supply chains. After this experience with the pandemic, we'll want our own capacity to make protective gear and ventilators. We already need to be thinking about critical technologies like 5G and not being so dependent on China. So those things are going to happen, but that is not an excuse for ceding leadership in the world to China, which, to get back to the point I was making earlier about the rise of autocracy, China is exporting its digital totalitarianism. That is a more potent threat, frankly, to democracy than anything coming out of a malignant but weakening, dying Russia. And so we need, I think, to be able to offer an alternative to this Chinese model. And right now, they have fodder to make the case in their handling of the pandemic and our enormous loss of life from the pandemic, even though China deserves enormous criticism and accountability for its lack of transparency in the early days and weeks of this pandemic.
And of course, where the parallel might break down between this rising confrontation and the Cold War of the second half of the 20th century is in the Cold War era, both the United States and the Soviet Union, both superpowers, reached out very aggressively throughout the globe, economically, diplomatically, and militarily. Right now, I think your point is well taken. The U.S., for all the reasons we've both been discussing, has not been nearly as aggressive on that front. I have to do this, Congressman. I had prepared a battery of questions for you about the pandemic, and it's pretty clear that I'm going to need to cede the floor in just a minute to go to a broader discussion with questions from our audience. But I do want to ask you one question about it. You brought it up a moment ago in the geopolitical context, but I'd like to bring this back to domestic politics and policy for a moment. Yesterday, the U.S. Senate passed a House bill that made adjustments in previous legislation to help small businesses in this country. But that was a pretty straightforward and not a particularly controversial measure. It seems that there's still a much bigger fight brewing over the next broader relief package. And I'm wondering if you can talk for just a couple minutes before we go to our audience questions about the role that Congress needs to play going forward to continue to push back against both the health and the economic threat that the virus is posing.
Thanks, Dan. And I think you're absolutely right. We have reached a point of divergence between the parties. In the early weeks and months of this pandemic, we rapidly came together, which is an astounding thing given how polarized the environment is, to agree on multi-trillion-dollar legislation to provide money for testing, for tracing, for our hospitals and our health clinics, but also to help rescue American families and businesses that were suddenly going from prosperity to a depression level of unemployment and instability. So we rapidly reached agreement. We passed most of that legislation on a consensus basis, which was also really important because we were unable to meet in the same ways that we had in the past. But now we have reached a point of divergence on a whole host of issues. There's leadership, obviously, in the GOP with Mitch McConnell and perhaps Kevin McCarthy as well, that is willing to let the states go bankrupt, that is questioning whether we should extend unemployment even though people remain unemployed. And so on these very big questions and many others, there are now big differences between the parties that will make it more difficult to get speedy relief the way we have up until this point. The small business measure that we passed in the House last week and passed this week in the Senate was an important fix to the PPP program, but it is relatively small in scope compared to the magnitude of the existing problem. Frankly, I think, and this is something I've advocated, although not yet to success, for several months, we would be wiser to follow the model that Germany and Britain and France, South Korea and Singapore, Norway, and other Scandinavian countries have employed, of having the federal government simply guarantee paycheck right now and payroll, rather than one program for small business, one for a medium-sized business with a lending facility, one for large business with this pandemic fund that the administration can decide where it goes. What these other countries are doing is simply having the government guarantee 80% of payroll or 90% of payroll until we get through this. And as a result, in Germany, you know, when I checked a couple of weeks ago, and it may have moved up modestly since then, German unemployment had only gone from 5.1 to 5.9%. In the United States, of course, it's gone from 3 to 4% to 20 to 25%. We are relying on unemployment as a policy choice. I think that's the wrong choice. If we can keep people connected to their employment by helping to subsidize that relationship until we get through the worst of this, then you don't have to spend, you know, that much more on healthcare over COBRA, because people retain their jobs and they retain their healthcare. You don't inundate our unemployment system because people kept their jobs. You don't have that lengthy delay to recover because people don't have to go looking for a job. They still have the job they had before the pandemic. So to me, you know, far from what the leadership in the GOP is advocating, which is go slow, maybe don't do any more, and just, you know, struggle our way through this, I think, frankly, we should embrace a more efficient, more equitable system, so that you don't have the banks deciding among their small business customers. You don't have the Trump administration deciding among their favored businesses and industries. And you don't have a lending facility that still is not fully up and running, but rather a much more equitable system in which all businesses, state and local governments alike, receive help until we get unemployment back to about 7%.
Well, and of course, just as a reminder, once again, to our audience, we are currently talking with Congressman McCarthy's staff. We'll hopefully have him on in the not too distant future to talk about his perspective on this. But last follow-up, I say greedily, you talked about providing that direct economic aid. And in most of the countries you've talked about, it has been very successful, but they provided those subsidies to the employers, to the businesses, both small and large. And I know one of the really pitched debates in this country, in Congress and elsewhere, is whether that financial support should be provided to the employers, to the companies, or directly constituted to the individual workers themselves. I want to make sure that I understood. Are you saying that providing that support through the employers makes more sense, or would either approach, in your opinion, be satisfactory?
Well, you know, I think if you look at what we're doing now, we're using a hybrid. The small business program, PPP, goes through employers. The Main Street Lending Facility for mid-sized businesses goes through employers, and so does the Large Industry Fund. Unemployment compensation goes to the individuals. Stimulus checks go to the individuals. So we're using a hybrid now. This would also be a hybrid. The bulk of it would go through employment to maintain that employment relationship, but it would be most beneficial to people receiving the paychecks. But we would also, for those that are self-employed, maintain the system of unemployment compensation. There might also be a role for stimulus checks, but frankly, stimulus checks are a very blunt instrument when they go out to everyone alike, no matter what the economic circumstances are. So I think that there's a reason why even the most progressive members of the Congress, the principal author of the bill that I'm supporting is Pramila Jayapal, who's the leader of the Progressive Caucus, favors this paycheck or payroll guarantee because it reaches more Americans, it helps more Americans, and it does so actually in a quite progressive way. So the checks would go out through Treasury, and they would go out on the basis of the employment relationship, but they might go out directly to the employees as well as the employers.
So that helps a lot. Thank you for clarifying. So let's very belatedly welcome Jessica DeGanzik to the conversation. She is bringing what I am guessing is a truckload of questions from our participants, and we'll do the best we can to get through as many as we can with our remaining time. Jessica, how does do we have any questions yet?
Way more than we're going to be able to get to, so I apologize right off the bat, but we'll start right away. Congressman Schiff, police reform is largely viewed as a local issue. What role do you see the federal government playing in this fight to end police brutality?
You know, I think the role that the federal government has traditionally played, it could play much better, and that is it can, through the Justice Department and the Civil Rights Division, conduct investigations that local authorities are not willing or not able to do themselves. So I think making sure that there is a strong civil rights division, which I think has been eviscerated by Bill Barr, is very important. I think setting national standards is really important. I think that establishing best practices can often be done at the national level and then been pushed out to the local level. That can be very important. So there are any number of ways in which the federal government can be a good partner. Certainly, funding is a ubiquitous way that we can help. In the legislation that I early on authored to help develop a body cams as a pilot measure early when it was controversial, was to establish best practice in the use of body cams and when those films would be made public, and to provide funding for departments to buy the equipment that didn't have the money for the equipment. So I think in all of these ways, the federal government can play a leadership role. I think we should also, at the national level, outlaw this practice of being able to choke people as a way of getting control. So all of these ways and many more, I think the federal government can play a leadership role.
Thank you so much. Given Los Angeles's role as a leader in aerospace and technology, are you advocating to bring Space Command's headquarters to Los Angeles?
Well, I would, of course, love to see all of the leadership brought to Los Angeles. You know, I think both in terms of whether it's Space Command or other defense enterprises, the LA delegation is in a position on a bipartisan basis to make a strong pitch. And of course, we have a very skilled and talented workforce to draw upon. So I would certainly support bringing any of these agencies to Los Angeles. And I think we've got a powerful case to make. I was very involved in the effort to lobby on behalf of Los Angeles as an Olympic destination. And I think for many of the same reasons of infrastructure, economy, capability, Los Angeles would be a superb choice.
If I can just follow up on that, Jessica, real quick, because Congressman, you raised a great point, and the questioner does as well. One of the reasons that so many of the protesters have gone to the streets is not just in reaction to issues relating to the police and to criminal justice, but also broader economic challenges. And really, since the end of the Cold War, the Southland has struggled in providing manufacturing jobs, other jobs that don't require a college diploma to large numbers of the population. Is that economic regeneration a part of the solution to the current crisis we've been discussing as well?
I think that's absolutely the case. And, you know, one of the points that I've been emphasizing during the course of the pandemic, which I think is all the more urgent now, given the imperative of reform, is that like other traumatic periods we've gone through, whether it was the Great Depression, World War II, or Vietnam, we have tried to build back a better society afterwards, build back better in the wake of those cataclysmic events. We ought to be thinking now about how we build back better as we come out of this pandemic, a more equitable, a more just society than the one we had going into it. I think the pandemic makes the case for universal health care very powerfully, for example. But I also think, you know, the continuing economic disparities clamor for action. The fact that so much of all the wealth that has been generated in the last 25 years has gone to the very top of the American economy and society. In other words, the degree to which the rich have gotten richer and the poor have gotten poorer and the middle class has fallen apart needs to be addressed. And so to the degree, for example, that the federal government can make siting decisions about where to locate agencies, where to help incentivize industry, it very much ought to be thinking in terms of how do we help communities that are struggling, how do we provide equity. To give you an illustration, the National Geospatial Agency, one of the large but little known intelligence agencies that does mapping from space, they had to move out of their headquarters. They have to move out of their headquarters in St. Louis because they're in a building that was actually a Civil War armory. It's that old and doesn't have the kind of wiring and infrastructure necessary for the future. And they looked at 4 different sites for where they could relocate that met all the criteria. What I urged the then director to do was pick the site that will do the most good. Pick the site that will be most beneficial in helping the community where it will be located. That site ended up being in St. Louis, in a different part of St. Louis, an economically depressed part of St. Louis. In fact, an area in St. Louis that in the 1970s was the site of a terribly failed effort to move the African American population into high rises and wall them off. And those high rises were never maintained by the US government. In fact, they had to be evacuated a short time later. The buildings were torn down, and that whole area remained fenced in and overgrown in the decades since. And here was an opportunity to actually bring a successful and important, economically stimulating enterprise to that part of a city. And that's ultimately what NGA decided to do. And I think we ought to be looking at exactly those factors as we cite different agencies or infrastructure projects.
Thank you so much. Do you think the media has been entirely fair in their coverage of the administration and your colleagues on the other side of the aisle? Would you like to see the media be more fair and balanced in their reporting of what's happening in our country to bring down the divisiveness?
I think the mainstream media has done an admirable job under the most difficult of circumstances. And I don't envy that challenge. If the media treats this president the way it treats other presidents, that is, it holds the president to account when they say something untruthful, then they need to point out every time the president is being disingenuous and untruthful. Now, that is largely what they've done. In fact, if anything, I think that they have been reluctant at times to do so for fear of appearing biased. But I think it's their responsibility to continue to hold the administration accountable, to hold people in Congress accountable, whether they like it or not, whether it appears to be partisan or not, because the crisis is recurrent. So I think they've done what they needed to do. Not how the mainstream media has covered the president, but the president's effort to paint them as the enemy of the people. That is, I think, delegitimizing of press that is maintaining high journalistic standards. It is the talk of tin pot dictators around the world. And to me, that is the gravest threat in terms of the First Amendment. I will also say that I think that some of what is, portrayed as media right now, and to give you the most profound example, this new network that bills itself as the conservative alternative to Fox, as if Fox wasn't conservative enough, OAN, really threatens to hold in disrepute the whole idea of journalism. When you have people who are admitted to the White House press corps who ask questions like, is Chinese food racist? To me, that just demeans the whole press enterprise. And that's much more of a concern to me, that you allow really non-credible press to occupy responsible positions like as part of the White House press corps. than how the mainstream press has covered this administration. So I appreciate the question, but I think it all gets back honestly to something that Steve Bannon, who has been an architect of much of the president's strategy, even when he was on the outs with the administration. Steve Bannon once remarked that the Democratic Party is not the enemy. The press is the enemy. And the way to beat the press is to flood the zone with excrement. Now, he didn't use the word excrement, he used a stronger word than that. But I think that is the strategy that the administration and the now White House press secretary use, which is to flood the zone with excrement so that people can't tell what's true or not, to push out completely alternate facts, that no, gas is not being used and I'm just doing an inspection in the bunker, and to try to reinvent history. I think that's the real disservice that worries me, honestly. The attack on the very idea of truth, the whole truth isn't truth, we're entitled to our own alternate facts view of things. To me, that is the problem, not how the press has been covering this presidency.
Thank you so much. Can you comment on likely Dem presidential nominee Biden? Does he need to hew to the center to appeal to crossover GOP voters, or move to the left to appeal to Sanders supporters?
I think that, and this gets back to, Dan, the question that you had asked earlier about the need for systemic change. I think that Joe Biden can appeal both to the progressive heart of the Democratic Party, as well as those people that voted for Obama and that voted for Trump, who are in economically depressed parts of the country, who are concerned about their future, because I think that what we really need right now is an economic agenda that lifts up every part of the country, that recognizes the enormous struggles that Americans are going through everywhere, but particularly in different regions of the country, and makes that a focal point of their economic plan, and addresses the fact that the middle class seems to be hanging by a thread, and that becomes more precarious every year. That's a very progressive agenda, but it's also a very populist agenda. So I don't think he needs to choose between the progressive base and the populist supporters of the president. I think he can do both. I think he'll need to do both. But I also think that a large part of appealing to the middle is less the policy prescription and more showing respect to everyone in every part of the country. By hearing out what they have to say, by going to where they are, which I know is going to be a challenge in the pandemic era. But if you're going to ask people for their support, you need to be willing to hear them out, and you need to show them respect. And I think that is something that the vice president has shown a unique ability to do. And if the pandemic will allow him to get out to parts of the country, and he will listen to what people have to say, show respect to them, I don't think there's anything inconsistent about that. Indeed, I think it's quite consistent with what the progressive base of the party is also clamoring for.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead, Jessica.
Sorry, this next questioner asks, assuming we continue as a democracy, not certain, why not push for public instead of private money for campaigns?
Well, I think that public financing ought to be available to states that choose to use that mechanism. And in fact, I introduced a constitutional amendment to allow states to do that after the court called into question whether states can even have public financing schemes. So I think that should be an option for states and localities to choose, given that the elections are run at the state and local level. So I think that indeed can be part of the solution. I do think that it's going to be very difficult, even with public financing, to overcome the advantage of very wealthy interests and very wealthy candidacies. But I do think it's important to try. I would say, though, that public financing needs to be coupled with limits on independent expenditures. And what my amendment would also do would be not just overturn Citizens United, but go back to a decision in Buckley versus Vallejo, a post-Watergate decision, when Congress, as part of those Watergate reforms, put limits on contributions directly to candidates. It also limited expenditures on behalf of those candidates. The Supreme Court in Buckley struck down half of that post-Watergate reform, the half that put limits on independent expenditures, reasoning that a contribution directly to a candidate could corrupt them, but an expenditure that was independent of the candidate couldn't possibly corrupt them, and therefore it couldn't be limited. But in practice, what that has meant is that a wealthy individual could only give $2,800 to Joe Biden or Donald Trump, but they could spend $28 million on the same candidacy, airing essentially the same commercial. That makes no sense. It's not as if the candidates are oblivious to those independent expenditures. So I think that public finance may be part of the solution, but it's only part of the solution. I think also putting limits on these vast expenditures as well as the dark money expenditures is also an important part of the solution.
Thank you. Do you think concerns recently expressed by retired General Jim Mattis and U.S. Senator Lisa Murkowski will have any impact on congressional colleagues and President Trump's response to peaceful demonstrations?
I think that what Secretary Mattis did and General Allen today had a piece in Foreign Affairs very similar to Secretary Mattis is enormously important. Less on the president. The president's simply going to lash out as he already did against Secretary Mattis. It's more important for the military to hear. It's more important for the Secretary of Defense to hear and for Chairman Milley of the Joint Chiefs to hear that there are respected voices within the military that do not want them to embroil the U.S. military in domestic politics and do not want to see them used in ways that are antithetical to the intent behind the founders and our constitutional structure. So I think those statements are most important as they influence the military. In terms of Lisa Murkowski and others within the Senate, so far what we have seen apart from Mitt Romney has been very thin gruel. Now I hope they'll speak out with greater strength, but frankly, we've been waiting for that for years now, for 3.5 years, for people of conscience within the GOP and the Congress to start acting on their conscience, to have the strength of their convictions. This president doesn't represent either what they purport to stand for in terms of ideology, things like free trade or family values or any number of other things that they have espoused over the years. He certainly doesn't represent what the Republican Party was supposed to be about in terms of morality or even faith in that horrible demonstration we saw in front of the church the other day. So, I hope that we'll see more of that. I have to say I've grown quite old waiting for that to happen. Mitt Romney was an extraordinary departure and an enormously courageous one. I have to think that senators that are saying things now, Lisa Murkowski among others, have to look at the courage that Mitt Romney displayed during the impeachment trial and look at that with a sense of admiration for what they were willing to do. But I fully expect that those comments will be continued to be in the minority. And in fact, Lindsey Graham will be more of the example than the exception.
Thank you so much. And this will be our final question. The questioner says, when he talked with you a few years ago, right after Trump was elected, you said, the Republic is strong, it will survive. Are you still as confident?
I am as confident that it will survive. But I have to say, quite chagrined that over the course of years since we had that conversation, that my colleagues in the GOP, and I hope you have an opportunity to have Kevin McCarthy, he's been among the most profound disappointments in the Congress. I've been surprised at their lack of devotion to the institution. To use Mr. McCarthy as an example, there is nothing the president wants him to do that he would refuse. There is no devotion to the Congress on his part, or the Constitution as far as I can see. And that's a surprise, not for in Kevin McCarthy's case, because I've known McCarthy a long time, sadly not a surprise, but for many others in the GOP, I had a much higher expectation and regard. There's a reason why Donald Trump can fire inspector generals at his pleasure. There's a reason why Bill Barr can intervene in criminal cases to help the president personally. And it's because the Republicans in Congress allow it to happen. If they were speaking out, if they were crying out, they would not, this would not be happening. They are deeply complicit in this steady erosion of our democratic institutions. And so I have to say, you know, looking back to those comments in that conversation of a few years ago, I had expected more and better from my colleagues than what we've seen. But nonetheless, I have confidence in our institutions and in our Constitution that we will get through this. I do think that the size of the repudiation, which I hope will come in November, will be very important not only to restoring Americans' faith in their own democracy, but restoring the confidence of the rest of the world in the American ideal. And to me, that's an ideal worth cherishing.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Dan, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jessica, and thanks all of you for joining this discussion today. Congressman, we're very, very grateful to have had you with us. And as you mentioned earlier as an aside, there wasn't just one issue, but probably about 7 or 8 that we probably could have talked about for an hour each. So next time we'd like to have you back for a 7 or 8 hour session, if we can arrange that with your staff. In the meantime, for those of you who've not tuned in to this series before, we meet every Thursday morning at 11 a.m., sometimes with a guest like we have today and will in the future, sometimes with just me offering some thoughts and answering more of your questions than we were unfortunately able to get to today. For those of you who are members of LA World Affairs Council, while these programs, of course, for all of you are free of charge, just a reminder that LA World Affairs Council members are privy to an additional 30-minute conversation, and I'll remind those of you who signed up for today's to sign on once we've concluded here today. But for right now, thanks so much to all of you who've joined us today for this discussion. We'll look back to having you in the future with future guests, both Republican and Democrat, and for our regular weekly discussion. And thanks once again so much to Congressman Adam Schiff for being with us today. Fascinating conversation, whether it's for 1 hour or several. We'll hope we can convince you to come back again in the future.
I look forward to it. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Schiff. And Dan, thank you again for another very informative discussion. Next week, we have June 9th, we have the ambassador to Germany, Dr. Emily Haber, in conversation with Ambassador John Emerson, chairman of the American Council on Germany. And of course, as Dan said, next Thursday, we're back with politics in the time of coronavirus. On your control panel, where you see the word handouts, you can click on that and see all of our upcoming programs. And please visit our website at lawac.org to see how you can register for upcoming events, sign up to become a member, or make a donation. Please stay safe, stay informed, and we hope to see you soon.